Welcome, everyone. It's really great to have you all join us for our first webinar of this year. My name is Salome, and I am the Perinatal Health Program Analyst on the Women's and Infant Health team at AMCHP. I'm also a part of the Innovation Hub Learning Community Work Group. And so I'm really excited for you all to learn more about today about ways that we can reframe and also reimagine some of our partnership building aspects within organizations. And so today's session will focus on power sharing and asset framing, and it's titled Who's at Your Table? Next slide, please. So, for those of us who are new and some of us who are rejoining us from sessions from last year or even the year before, we wanted to just give an overview about what the webinar series is. And so the webinar series, it really focuses on skills and strategies you can apply to your work to improve your organizational processes and really expand some of the scope and impact of your practice and plan for sustainability. It's open not to just Innovation Hub practices, but to everyone. And so whether you are Innovation Hub practice or whether you are looking to become an Innovation Hub practice, these webinar series will really provide you with more information as it relates to some of your own program implementation strategies. Next slide, please. So for the sake of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on power sharing, power dynamics, and asset framing. And so the first objective that we're going to explore is that we're going to learn how to apply an asset framing lens as a first step to begin partnership building. And this is internally as an organization, even externally. The next objective, we're going to gain an awareness on the racial equity readiness assessment tool and how to apply it in your work. And lastly, you're going to understand how power dynamics and asset framing plays a role in building partnerships. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today, we're going to start off by giving you a quick little overview, also kind of a rerun from our session in November on asset framing, but really diving more into how you build connections using an asset framing lens. Next, we're going to talk more about the racial equity readiness assessment tool and how to use that. We'll also provide an overview of power dynamics and power sharing, and we'll also review the power awareness tool in this section. And then lastly, we'll be having a Q&A section where you can ask us questions. And during that time, feel free to add it straight to the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or even add it into the chat. But we'll be answering all questions towards the end. Next slide, please. And as we go through today's session, we're going to be really looking at how to apply these tools in real time. And so this is a scenario and a case study that we want you to keep kind of in the forefront of your mind because we'll be using some of these tools and applying it to this case study. And this case study is focused on workforce development program that was developed for young parents. And so your organization just added a 12-month program to support young parents returning to the workforce. And within this program, young parents who have already been back in the workforce will be serving as paid subject matter experts on an advisory committee. Your team's role will be to ensure young parents are receiving support throughout their 12 months in the program. You'll be incorporating the racial equity readiness assessment tool and the power awareness tool to assess how subject matter experts and employees are engaging with each other and young parents participating in the program. So keep this in the forefront of your mind as we go through the information you'll learn today. And with that, I will pass it on to Michaela to present about asset framing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Salome. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Fry. I am a program manager on AMCHP's Workforce Development and Capacity Building team. And I've been working on the IHLC for quite some time now, and so it's nice to see some familiar names in the chat. Like Salome said, some of this presentation, especially this asset framing portion, is a little bit of a repeat, rerun, refresh from our November meeting when we talked about evidence-based decision-making and asset framing. So for those who joined us in November, these first 10 or so minutes might be a little familiar to you, but we thought it would be nice to reground ourselves in asset framing for this topic as well. What is asset framing? We will do an overview of asset framing, but first we should look through and ground ourselves in deficits framing. Deficit framing is the act of defining people by their problems, often through the lens of outside experts. Additionally, deficit framing does not give us a clear vision of the future, but instead focuses on problems and adverse experiences of the past. Unfortunately, deficits framing is the dominant narrative framework in public health, and many, if not all of you, have probably seen this language, have seen language that mobilizes deficit framing. We often use deficit framing language to describe our missions and visions as nonprofits or governmental public health organizations, not because we inherently want to paint communities as riddled with problems per se, but often because we are trying to communicate or emphasize a crisis or to acknowledge disparities in health outcomes. And as we all know, the more that we can elicit, the framing of like problems or opportunities for us to do programming, we get more funding. So this often works to our advantage when we're thinking about the funding landscape. So with that in mind, with deficits framing in mind, let's think back to our scenario. And thinking about what I just said about grant funding, imagine you are writing a grant proposal to fund your project idea. What might a short project overview look like if it was created with deficits framing? It could look something like this. It could look like our program will address the workforce development and retention needs of young at-risk parents, a population that experiences high rates of unemployment and poverty. Over the course of 12 months, our program will focus on finding and coordinating support for vulnerable young parents returning to the workforce after experiencing unemployment. We will partner with previously affected vulnerable young parents through an advisory committee to augment the program's goodness of fit. We also go on to say our program will create employment stability in an unstable population by building participant confidence, connecting participants to basic professional necessities, for example, professional clothing or public transportation access passes, and facilitating relationship building with a mentor. All right, so looking at this statement from our scenario, what language might be jumping out to you as deficits framing? And you can just like pop in the chat. It could be one word, a phrase that you're finding. At-risk parents. Thank you. I see in the chat. High rates of unemployment and poverty, unstable population, vulnerable young parents, previously affected. Yeah, you guys are hitting it right on the nose. Vulnerable. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of these stigmatizing terms jumping out to us, right? Jumping out at us. Yeah, so you all pointed to harmful language such as at risk, vulnerable, previously affected, unstable, and overall language that defines population, young parents by their deficits. I like how someone pointed out in the chat, high rates of unemployment and poverty. This is really framing young parents, by the deficits or the problems that they're facing, not necessarily by their assets and strengths that they bring to the table. Sorry, looking at my notes, see what else I wanted to say here. Great. So as you may recall, our topic today is around power sharing and partnerships, and using deficits framing language when talking about community partners or partners with lived experience may indicate that your program is not ready to support equitable power dynamics within that partnership. If there are current partnerships with community partners, deficits framing and approaching the partnership with a deficits lens may be negatively impacting that relationship. Yeah, and then specifically at the portion of the project overview that states the program's intention to partner with young parents, we do see that there is, deficit framing language there. Someone pointed out, previously affected young parents here. Right. And then here I just highlighted some of the terms that you all brought to light here. All right, so with deficits framing in mind, what is assets framing? Assets framing is the remedy to a deficit framing lens. So as opposed to deficit framing, asset framing is defining and framing people first and foremost by their aspirations and contributions, right? Not by their problems. It's not about ignoring the hardships communities face though, but rather focusing on their strengths, gifts, talents, aspirations, contributions, and assets before and during sharing the hardships and challenges they face. So by focusing on aspirations and contributions, we can set the stage for forward-focused solutions whose main goals are to support people in achieving their dreams and actualizing their value, as opposed to solutions that focus on fixing people and their communities. And I like this graphic to delineate the differences between deficits framing and assets framing. It's like, what do we really mean here? Not only do deficits and assets framing refer to language choices, right? Or the way that we are painting a picture of a community, but also in what we're measuring and our metrics and our evaluation, right? It shows the difference between what we value when it comes to metrics. So with deficits, things that we usually address when we're talking about like program proposal, for example, are like poverty, suicide, alcohol abuse, or foster care. Whereas assets really build upon things that are already present in communities, for example, cultural identity or social connections, health and wellness and resilience. Our perspective is quite different here, right? With deficits framing, it's usually outside experts are coming in, right, and creating a narrative around a population or a community, whereas assets really do focus on community wisdom, right, family wisdom. And our main lens here are also very different. So with deficits, the main lens comes from intervening. We're doing interventions. We're creating solutions, right, to problems that exist. Whereas assets framing really does focus on, building upon what is already there. So building on relationships, right? We're really focusing on equity and well-being, and making sure that our participants can self-determine, right? And that we have a clear vision of the future. Since we are talking about partnerships and power sharing today, I wanted to do a quick reframing exercise with you all, but just with the portion of the project overview that describes the program's partners. So this is just something that, I came up with as an exercise. When we're doing reframing exercises, everyone's going to approach it differently here. And this is just one example of how you could approach this sentence when reframing from deficits to asset frame. Yeah, the initial statement, as we talked about, did frame young parents through deficits, by saying you previously affected vulnerable young parents. It did not mention any strengths or assets young parents bring. We reframed the sentence to celebrate and highlight the expertise of young parents and express some other strengths they possess. We decided to relinquish some of the power we hold as program staff here by positioning the young parent advisors as subject matter experts and expressing that their expertise comes first and foremost in creating and maintaining a successful program. So we'll dive deeper into power sharing with partners and the difference between power and privilege. But this is also just one example of how asset framing can be a tool in power sharing and accountability. Yeah, and this is just something to practice on your own. So I do encourage you all to revisit these slides after the webinar to practice your own assets based reframe here. Thinking about how would you reframe this project overview to go from a deficits lens to an asset lens. But we will not do that now, so no worries. Yeah, and with that, that was just a quick overview of asset framing. These slides will be available post-webinar and with other resources as well. But before I turn it back over to Salome, are there any questions from you all around asset framing? Okay, I'm seeing and hearing none so far, but feel free to chat in the chat your questions or put them in the Q&A thread, and we will make sure to get to them. All right, Salome.
Michaela. And so, like Michaela said, asset framing is really a framework and a lens that really can be applied across all of the tools that we'll talk about today. And so, the first tool that we're going to share today is the Racial Equity Readiness Assessment. And this tool is really to help provide you with the information you need to advance racial equity more systemically and also strategically and successfully. And so the goal of using the racial equity readiness assessment is to really help normalize the practice of explicitly examining how your organization is addressing racism and advancing racial equity. And so really clarifying your purpose really means thinking about, what are specific benefits of making a racial equity assessment and including racial equity within the organization or the framework of your organization. What are the benefits about doing this, especially as it relates to engaging with partners? And so the first thing is to create an equity team. And what this means is that, this should really include a variety of perspectives involved and be reflective of the community and the workforce that you serve. And so this means being inclusive across race, gender, and other intersectional and important identities that some of your members may identify with. And also, it could also include being inclusive of members across different departments, right? It may not just be internal to your specific team, internal to your organization, but also might include different departments that should be a part of creating the assessment or providing information into the assessment. And then the next thing you want to do is really review the entire tool before you add any pieces. This will really give you an opportunity to brainstorm and collect the necessary information that you need in order for the assessment to go as smoothly as possible and to ensure that you have everything added so that way you can identify, your level of readiness. Next, you're going to complete the responses in stages. And so this means that you want to go through the questions in stages when scoring. Each area that you will score will be on a scale of 1 to 4. And this really is based off of, how is this area being addressed? You want to consider which parts will require more research. Sometimes, it might be best to just include whatever information or knowledge that you currently have within that specific focus area. Other times it might be that you need to create a work plan or create some goals so that way you can come back to that specific focus area and be able to really contribute and add information. And then you want to also conduct necessary analysis for a work plan and a work plan under this. And that really goes directly in towards your final step, which is really gathering and analyzing key findings. And after you analyze your key findings, you want to create that work plan towards a goal setting. And so these might be recommendations for action or change. You might be prioritizing, what you will work on, and that prioritization might look different from what you initially planned. And essentially, you want to make sure that these recommendations turn into clear goals. So that way you can also evaluate the progress of those goals. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the assessment breakdown, you'll see that there's a lot on the screen, but I will show you kind of how to break it down piece by piece. So on the left side, this is a direct screenshot from the actual assessment tool. And basically you'll find that under each focus area, you'll have guiding principles, and it will be defined based on that focus area. But you'll have your guiding principles such as your stakeholder engagement, right? And so this is really looking at, are we really engaging um, people of color that are participating in our program or future partners in ways where it is equitable and also where there's implementation of decision making. So, if we're receiving feedback from some of our partners, is this feedback being implemented in any way? You'll also see that it would be a guiding principle under race explicit strategy. And so this is really also tying into that piece of implementation and really engaging and making sure that your guiding principles under each focus area are addressing, your lens around racial equity. And that also, and thinking about asset framing, right? You want to definitely apply an asset frame to a lot of these categories and breakdowns. And then outcome oriented, that's pretty straightforward. What are the outcomes, but also how are the outcomes really benefiting our clients? How are the outcomes also benefiting our organization? How are they sustaining the partnerships that exist within our organization? And when we talk about sustaining, I want to emphasize that that really means not just the 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 how should I say this? Sustaining really means ongoing, right? So like it's not necessarily in this moment we're saying, okay, we want to sustain this relationship, but even after that relationship is over, even after our clients receive the resources that they need, there should still be an ongoing plan or guidelines as to how you are keeping in connection, right? Staying in relationship with those individuals and groups. Then you're going to perform a systemic analysis, and that's where a lot of that goal setting, a lot of that providing recommendations will be. And then culture of practice, right? So like what shifts need to take place within your scope of practice, within your organization, for you to really be able to get to the piece of engaging partners, right? Working directly one-on-one with partners, because this tool itself is really going to help you assess as an organization if you're even in a state where you can fully engage with partners, or even if partners are ready to engage with you, right? And as you'll see, it's a scoring guide on the screen as well. And like I said, the scoring guide is based off of your level of addressing these needs. And then your focus areas will align directly with your organization, right? So your mission, your values, and your culture. So under each focus area, you'll find an ultimate goal that you want to achieve. And so based off of that, you'll include information within the guiding principles that say, okay, so under our mission, values, and culture, right, we said that racial equity is a core part of our organizational mission. Now, how are we actually putting this into play, into action? And so those guiding principles will help you figure out what elements you might need to address better as an organization as a whole. So next you'll have customer access to services and tracking disparities. So, the goal is that there are no internal organizational barriers and biases that are preventing clients of color from accessing our services. And then you'll also have curriculum and client services, which is under this, clients of color we serve are involved in the decision-making process of curriculum development that covers substantive principles around racial equity frameworks. Next, you'll talk more about leadership and staffing, and that is really, internal to your organization. So, you want to make sure that staff of color are proportionally representative of the community that you're serving, but also are feeling represented as a staff member and on leadership structure. And then lastly, you'll be looking at your external relationship and advocacy, right? So all leadership and staff are equipped with racial equity frameworks that inform internal and external work practices, decision-making capabilities, and advocacy efforts for the clients of color that are being served. And so, this is a lot of information, but it really, I think, as an organization, allows you to even think and like reimagine, reframe, or even just emphasize and add more value to the level of work that you're already doing. And so if we were to apply this right to our scenario, in our scenario, we said that we wanted to have young parents participate in the program, but we also wanted to improve our support services towards young parents. So by doing this, we're going to have young parents serve as subject matter experts, right? But let's say that during this phase, before we even initiated the program or even shared application or shared that this program was available for young parents returning back to the workforce to apply for, we noticed that, we don't really have a good representation of young parents, especially we didn't really have any representation of Black young parents, right? And so we can use the racial equity readiness assessment tool to understand as an organization, why was it that the majority of young parents that we did not see were identified as being Black. And we could say that, maybe there's a reputation that our organization holds that does not make them feel comfortable to attend the program or to serve as subject matter experts. We can identify, how we can provide care, but also how we can provide our organization to become better at supporting and valuing and culturally representing racial communities. Especially in this case, we can provide ways in which, how do we support Black young parents to participate? How do we implement some of those feedback and some of the solutions that they even provided to us in previous programming that, maybe as an organization we have yet to include in our programming. And so we really have to go back to the drawing board to understand how, as an organization, you can align your mission to really better assist, in this case, young parents, but really to better assist your clients. And that means really identifying what barriers exist internally and externally. Next slide, please. So that was a little breakdown of the racial equity readiness assessment tool. And now we're going to dive more into, power dynamics and how does power dynamics and privilege show up in your everyday practice, but also within your organization. And I just want to highlight that this content that we'll be sharing was developed by Chanel Tage, who is part of AMCHP's Women's and Infant Health team, but it was also developed in collaboration with a project that was done with the Healthy Beginnings project in the Learning and Practice cohort. Next slide, please. So these are just some key elements to understand when you're defining power dynamics, and even in this conversation when we're talking about power dynamics. And it's that, power is defined and understood in various ways. It manifests itself in various ways, but ultimately it really will contribute to an imbalance between groups and individuals, right? And so that means that personal and organizational privilege and power will have a direct influence on external perceptions and opportunities that exist for individuals and for groups. We want to also acknowledge our own power and privilege prior to developing new relationships and partnerships, because that will really focus on creating those sustaining and those ongoing relationships. And so, privilege is often associated with racial, social, educational, and economic status. But we can also think about our privilege and positionality as employees within our organization, right? And so, for instance, my privilege in working with AMCHP and having those direct relationships with Title V state agencies is totally different from a community rooted organization having those direct relationships with a Title V agency. And so the key in all of this, though, what I will add is that, in sustaining these relationships and making them ongoing and identifying your power dynamics is really communicating and listening, right? And so when you are brainstorming or when you are in the position of, identifying what power dynamics, what power sharing, what power hoarding looks like, you want to adjust your power dynamics towards more equitable power sharing for sustainable partnerships. And that really involves communicating, previously or currently how you may not align yourself with power sharing, and being very upfront about that, but also listening to how partners would like for power sharing to exist within your relationship. Next slide, please. So this definition was developed, like I said, with AMCHP's Healthy Beginnings. And so this is the definition we'll use for this section of the presentation. But really, like I said, power is an imbalance between individuals and groups and access to resources, right? This is something that we all are probably familiar with and understand. And so those with greater economic and social capital, of course, hold more power and hold greater influence. And an individual's ability, race, gender, and sexual orientation are often associated with the status of power, privilege. And then we're also going to be defining privilege as an advantage given to an individual or a group that either exempts liability or provides benefits that are not available to others. And this is also very much associated with racial, social, educational, and economic status. And the ability, gender, and sexual orientation of individuals often dictate their privilege and their power. So next slide. So before we move on to, applying power awareness tool, I want to see, from your perspective, even, whether it be interpersonal or also even just in your work and everyday practice, what terms come up when you think about power? Like, how do you define power? What words pop out to you? Um, okay, we have one in the chat. And feel free to also just throw it in the chat for the sake of time. I had a Mentimeter, but we can use the chat. So thank you, Todd. You said influence and control. Yes, those are great examples. How else do you define power? Ability to persuade, make changes. Yeah, that is a power tactic, definitely. I see people already added to the Mentimeter, so I can also read off of this slide. Wealth of knowledge, wealth, we see wealth a lot, influence, controls agenda, control, strength, strong. And so very similar terms that you all used. Ability to stop things you don't want happening to you or others or your program. Yep. I think that it's important to note that, a lot of the words that you all just shared, you used it just in different levels, right? Like you use control, you use strength, you use strong. A lot of these are definitely ways in which power is hoarded and power is controlled. And so thank you for sharing that. And voice, yeah, cool. So back to our presentation. So, based off of the ways in which you all just provided definitions around what power looks like or how power even manifests itself, there's ways that we can address power dynamics and partnerships. There's no one cookie cutter way there because power manifests itself in so many different ways. And you can go on to the next slide. One thing that was created out of this partnership was that the triple A's. And so this will really help you understand, your readiness to address power, but also help you understand and give you a gauge on how power may exist within your organization or programmatic activities. And so the first thing you want to do is really assess, right? Assess your personal and organizational privilege. So like I said earlier, we have privilege that based off of our race, we have privilege based off of our class. We have privilege based off of our positionality within our organization. But it's really important that we assess this because, we show up to our organization and our practices and our programs, not just with our titles and our roles, but also with our own personal privileges. And with that, with acknowledging that, you can really influence power dynamics, right? And switch your power dynamics towards building more partnership building and creating that balance within power sharing. And then next, you want to adjust, right? So shift and you share your power. adjust where areas where you see that there is power hoarding, or you see that there is not an acknowledgement for how power dynamics is manifesting itself. It's really important to communicate that, and to also share power, make solutions towards keeping that more of a balanced relationship, which will then eventually should contribute to an equitable partnership. Next slide, please. So now that you have an understanding of how we're defining power, how we're talking about power awareness, and how we're also talking about power dynamics, we're going to go into looking at the power awareness tool, which will help you understand and also assess how you can work with your partners and levels to working with your partners. Next slide, please. So what is a power awareness tool? So this tool was initially created by Partos Shift the Power Lab, which is an organization based in Amsterdam. But they initially created it to really understand and analyze the relationships between NGOs and local organizations. And that's something that, even when we think about power, not power, but when we think about partnerships and relationships, especially in our field, in our realm of public health, that is very similar. We talk a lot about how can we work more with community rooted or community based organizations, especially coming from organizations that are known to own most of the power per se. So it really addresses power imbalances. It addresses how power operates. It causes you to analyze power and partnerships for development. And when you're thinking about who needs to be involved, right, you want to really make sure that you have a representation of all partners who know about the organization, who know about the program, like everyone who basically is involved with any levels to, if it's a program, if it's an organization, if it's even just wanting to initiate a partnership because you see that it could really be beneficial to improving your organization as a whole. You want to make sure that there is representation of everyone who is involved in that process. And so if you have representation of everyone, then there's no need to have an external facilitation, right, in that space, because it should be that space is being facilitated by everyone in terms of the deciding factors and the levels to how decision making is taking place. And so you'll see on the right side, it's a diagram of the ladder of participation in decision making. And so this really depicts a number system that's used to represent the level of participation each partner will have in making a decision. But it's also important to recognize that the number does not dictate how much power a partner has, but really emphasizes the importance and the contributions that a partner will have in a specific topic area. So I want you to keep this in mind as we will use this as guidance to apply the tool to our case study in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So there are three really main ways to follow the power awareness tool. And so the first step is really identifying important decision-making topics. And this really requires you to build that team, facilitate, and converse with each other about, what decision-making topics need to occur in order for the partnership to be successful. And also, how are you even defining what success looks like within a partnership? It's important to note that team members representing different partners may have diverging views on what's important, right? So one person might recommend a decision-making topic area that, the whole team did not even, vote on or recommend, but it's really important that you make sure to include every topic area, even if only one partner considers it, because, along the lines, as you flesh out some of the information that you gain from this, you might even go back to the drawing board and be like, that topic area is actually great in aligning with this decision-making process that we just initiated. So make sure you list out all decision-making topics, whether you use it or not. Next, you want to score the level of participation of each partner in decision-making. And so for each of these topics, the team scores a relative power that I shared with you earlier, which is the level in which the partner will decide when it comes to decision-making topics. And so it's important to note that, even if a topic is still under development, it's really good to still include that into your tool because it really will help you understand still, like, once you get to that point, where you are initiating that topic area, where you're implementing that topic area, you still have an understanding on how each partner should be engaged once it starts. And like I said, scoring a 4 does not mean that that person has power, but really it's a very relative, and it's really based on the level of engagement that each individual should have. And then finally, you're going to reflect on those findings, right? You're going to ask yourself some guiding questions like, are all these decision-making topics relevant, to what we were trying to achieve? Is there a level of participation of a specific partner that, we think we should engage more with, or, we should reevaluate that level of participation? If the partner is not able to have more influence, what measures are needed to change this in order to ensure that they feel like they are represented in that. And so you also just want to remember some key things. Like I said, you want to establish the right atmosphere. Communication is key in this, and analyzing um, your own power within this partnership, within this space, is very important. You want to encourage transparency so that way folks feel very comfortable to provide their feedback, and avoid any negative consequences that come with not encouraging transparency. And then you want to just really achieve more balanced power relations, and just remind the participants the intention, right, of having this space. And so it might be that you create a guidelines, or you create some community guidelines where you review it before you meet, and keep it at the forefront, so that way folks are always reminded of it. And then you also just want to continue to repeat the process at different stages of partnership engagement. Next slide, please. So a lot of information, but now we get to apply this to our workforce development program, right? And so it's important that before we apply this tool, we just identify who and our what. So like, who's going to be involved, and like, what is the goal, and why are we trying to achieve this goal, right? And so we said that the goal of this program was to really support young parents returning back to the workforce. We identified that our partners are going to be, um, our cohort of young parents. We're going to want to listen to, the information that they're sharing with us, the feedback that they're giving us. But we're also going to be working with subject matter experts, which are the young parents who've already been back in the workforce. And then we're also going to work directly with the program manager, right, who's leading all of these initiatives. And so we want to ensure that parents are receiving support throughout their 12 months in the program, but really touching on that support piece, because we want to make sure that we are defining support in the ways that in which that they are asking for it, right? Next slide, please. So this is the tool. This is a direct copy of what the tool would look like. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see that those are the topic areas. They already provide you with a focus area, and then you will create the decisions that occur within those focus areas. So focus areas are scoping and building your practice or program, managing and maintaining your practice or program, revisiting and revising your practice and program, and then what are the sustaining outcomes of this? And so when thinking about this and identifying this from our case study and working with young parents, we identified that, we wanted to make decisions about eligibility requirements that will be involved in participating, decisions concerning changes in the day-to-day activities or implementation of programmatic activities, decisions about what measurements will need to be used when we're talking about or creating our evaluation, to measure the success. And then also we want to find ways how we can engage partners about decisions related to a fundraising event. So like, what donors should we include in a fundraising event that will help us align and continue providing these supports, and continuing the program. And so we identified, who our partners are going to be, and based off of these, we scored our partners. And so you can see that for the majority, there is a little consensus when you look at revisiting and revising, you'll see that, program managers score to be a decider, partner decides, and a young parent scored to be 3, which means that they are a co-decider. And then a young parent who's been back in the workforce for 3 months scored to be consulted before decision making. And so um, these these markers can really help us see, where and at what level of decision making should partners engage with. And so I think when we talk about decision making a lot, we talk about just being present at the table, but we don't necessarily talk about, what presence will look like. And this breakdown with the numbers, I really like how they break it down in a way where you can understand, who is making the decision or versus who's just going to be consulted. And so when we look at this, some guiding questions that help us, we want to see what levels of participation need to be reexamined now that the program has officially started. And so for instance, if we're looking at revisiting and revising and we see the numbers, or specifically we see sustaining outcomes, right? We see the numbers are totally different, where a program manager is a 4 and everybody else is a 1. If we're going back and we're re-looking at and re-examining how we can engage with our partners, we might say, why is it that you might have a partner come to us and say, why is it that we are only informed about that decision, especially because in my experience as a young parent in my community, um, I've experienced relationships with previous donors in this program who have been detrimental to my community. And so I would like to be engaged at a higher level, and I would like to be involved in who is contributing and attending this event around fundraising and how other young parents can contribute to the organization of fundraising. And so it's important to ask yourself those questions, but also ask group questions to allow folks within the group to understand ways that they can engage if they are not satisfied with the levels of engagement there. Next slide, please. So this is to summarize it all of everything that we shared today. You want to first examine your scope of practice, right, to better understand how you can apply asset framing to partnership building. And this really means that you want to focus asset framing versus deficit framing. But if you are working from a lens of deficit framing, how can you make that shift towards asset framing? Then you also want to use the racial equity readiness assessment tool to help your organization to identify levels of readiness to create new partnerships. And I want to also add that, the racial equity readiness assessment tool really focuses on building racial equity, but also re-examining how you are serving communities of color. But I think that, the way that in which they've provided an outline, it can really be reused to assess across, outside of even a racial equity lens, assess across your organization how you can better serve some of your partners. And so keep that in mind when you're using it. You can definitely use it to help you create your own tools within your organization. And then you're also going to talk more about, talking more about power dynamics. We share that this can really help us identify how power hoarding or power sharing manifests and how we can create more of a balanced relationship so that way we can have more ongoing relationships. And then lastly, the power awareness tool can be used to help the level of participation partners receive when acting as decision makers. And so because we're running out of time and I want to make sure folks get their questions answered, we can go ahead to the next slides. And we can also pull up the evaluation about this session. We ask that if you have anything that you want to share and any questions that you might have, please feel free to share them in our Q&A section. And then you can go ahead to the next slide. These are also opportunities that I want to share. These are for Innovation Hub practices. And we'll share this in an email following, but please be on the lookout for some of the signups around customized coaching and also collaborative circle. Next slide, please. And then completing the evaluation poll. You should probably see it pop up now. And then next slide, please. Yeah, we'll pass it to anybody who has questions. Hopefully you all can stay on a little bit longer. We also just want to share that the next session is on May 30th, and it's going to be more about intentional strategic planning. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Okay, we have one question. Do you have any other examples of moving from deficit framing to asset framing? Michaela, would
Yeah,
you like to answer that?
yeah, this is Michaela. I think with our resources, we can send out November's webinar as well that has more examples of shifting from deficits to assets framing that I think could be really helpful. So we can definitely share more of those with you.
Any other questions? And like Michaela said, we'll be sharing this all out, the resources along with the resource sheet. So if you want to add to your information from your organization. Linda says, do you have examples of doing this in your own work? I would say for the Women's Infant Health team, like I said, the Healthy Beginnings Project was definitely an area where we worked directly with community rooted organizations and Title V agency. And the plan was to really build state action plans. But one thing that we saw was that even though this was an 18-month project, we had to spend the majority of the months really focusing on partnership building and what that looks like. And so that really is why we developed the power sharing learning bundle, which is on our site. But that really helped us understand and have a very frank conversation with Title V agencies participating on, reasons and the history behind why, community rooted organizations have been and sometimes still are hesitant in creating those relationships. And so I think that that was a really great way for us to apply that lens to the work. I don't know, Michaela, if you have any other examples in your work.
I was actually just thinking about the ways in which the Women and Infants Health team was really great at facilitating these kinds of conversations with um, Title V departments and their community-rooted organization partner and the Healthy Beginnings Learning and Practice cohort. So not exactly an example of how we've applied it, but how we've helped walk people through various tools and assessing power dynamics, power sharing, partnership, racial equity, readiness for partners as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll also throw in my email into the chat. If any questions come up over time, or even if you're an Innovation Hub practice and you're just wanting to learn more about how you can apply this directly into your organization or wanting to talk through some of those ideas, we can definitely schedule a one-on-one with you all to talk through some of that. Yeah. I like Mark's comment. I appreciate assets framing and realize the problematic history of some words we have used in our partnerships, like stakeholders, yep, target groups. However, we are having a difficult time creating a new set of terms to replace these words. Well, Mark, I will actually share with you as a part of the Healthy Beginnings project, that was another thing that we also saw. And it was actually developed previously on the evidence implementation team, and that is the harm reducing language presentation, as well as a glossary of terms. And so we can share that with you. And because we also noticed that too within our Innovation Hub practices, but the actual document, we weren't necessarily using correct language towards that. And Linda shared that. And that's something that we'll also add to the resource sheet, is sharing the page where all the Healthy Beginnings learning bundles are, because a lot of it focused on goal setting around relationship building. And it could really be helpful in applying this lens to your work. So let me get that for you. You can access the information around Healthy Beginnings, but also on harm reducing language at that link. Thank you for that, Mark. Cool. Well, we have 1 more minute left, so still for any comments. Thank you, Marquisia. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. But thank you so much for your comment. I think that, yes, to your point, that it is important to make sure that voices are heard, and that's why, we even saw that included in some of the in the Mentimeter survey about, how do you define power. It is very important to take that seriously when applying these techniques. Great. Well, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please be on the lookout for the email we'll be sending out next week with all of these resources, and as well as a link to this recording. And we hope to see you in May for our next session. And for those of that might be joining us at our conference in April, we also look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.